Welcome to this short format of news items. Silicon Wafers. Moscow says it has an offer. Vladimir Putin wants Volodymyr Zelenskyy to come to Moscow for a peace talk with 100% security. The same Moscow where critics are poisoned, shot, or fall from windows. What has Putin really proposed? Why some headlines took it at face value, some media outlets, without adding the context of Moscow's infamous lethality for opponents of the Putin regime, and why the risks of a Moscow summit are not just diplomatic, they're mortal. An irresistible invitation. This week, Putin went public with an outlandish and entirely disingenuous offer. He's ready to meet Zelensky, apparently, but only if the Ukrainian president travels to Moscow. Reuters captured the line Putin is prepared to talk if he comes to Moscow, but made no sign of softening on core demands. That's in Reuters. He put the phrasing even plainer at a Beijing presser later in the week. Ultimately, if Zelensky is ready, let him come to Moscow. Then the meeting will take place. We don't need any other venues. That was reported in Anadolu, September 3rd, 2025. The Kremlin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, tried to reframe the phrasing to make it sound less outlandish, but of course failed hopelessly. The invitation, he said, was to talk and not to capitulate. But as the saying goes, don't believe something until the Kremlin denies it. So these would not be talks, but a circus to inflict capitulation onto Zelensky. Hours later, the Kiev Post quoted Putin promising, "Please come, we will absolutely ensure the conditions for work and security, a 100% guarantee." Putin is not a man in whose hands you would put your life. He's proven to be as remarkably careless with others' lives as he is careful with his own. And Ukraine's response, well, Zelensky called the venue demand a trap, not a concession. As Medusa quoted him in Paris, "If your aim is to prevent a meeting, then inviting me to Moscow is the way to go." That's dated September 5th, 2025. As always, Zelensky nails the reality of the situation. Let's not forget what happened to Prigozhin after Putin made him an offer he could not refuse. Rapid mid-air disassembly of his plane. Negotiations and security guarantees Kremlin style. So we should not blame Zelensky for turning down such a poisoned chalice of an offer. Well, context matters in this case. Just 2 days after dangling that guarantee, Putin in Vladivostok warned that any foreign troops in Ukraine would be legitimate targets. So come to Moscow and make peace, yet we will not tolerate any international force to guarantee that security that follows on an apparent offer. Well, it's hard to take such a safety guarantee seriously when the guarantor is simultaneously expanding the target set to include the peacekeepers who are supposed to enforce that peace. And if this script sounds familiar, well, it is. Back in 2021, Putin said he'd host Zelensky at any time in Moscow, only for talks to evaporate as the Kremlin kept to its maximalist lines. Don't expect any concessions this time either, rather an ever-lengthening list of new demands. Well, that was reported in Reuters. Why a Moscow meeting is a security hazard, not a diplomatic venue. Let's be blunt, the idea that Zelensky would fly in, sign a peace, and fly out as if this were Oslo or Geneva is, of course, ridiculous. The Russian state's record with opponents and inconvenient witnesses reads like a charge sheet of a serial killer. Alexander Litvinenko, 2006, a British public inquiry found a strong probability that FSB agents poisoned him with polonium and that the operation was probably approved by President Putin. That was reported in the Guardian inquiry article January 21st, 2016. Sergei and Yulia Skripal, 2018. UK authorities concluded a Novichok nerve agent was used. Later investigations unmasked GRU officers behind the attack. That was covered by the Times and Bellingcat and, of course, Guardian extensively. Alexei Navalny, 2020, poisoned. 2024, his death in prison. Bellingcat with partners traced an FSB chemical weapons unit that tailed Navalny before the Novichok attack. One officer even inadvertently confessed operational details in a recorded call. Vladimir Karamazov, twice poisoned, 2015, 2017, and then later jailed. Amnesty notes that no investigation was carried out by Russian authorities. Bellingcat linked the same FSB unit that stalked Navalny to Karamazov's poisoning. That was reported by Amnesty and Bellingcat. Boris Nemtsov, 2015, assassinated steps away from the Kremlin itself. Investigative work indicates FSB-linked surveillance before his murder. That's reported in Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe. A pattern of falls from windows. We all know, we've all followed these stories, that after 2022, a string of elites and officials have died by defenestration, including Lukoil's Ravil Maganov. That is reported in Axios and Bloomberg. To pretend that this environment can host a good faith summit without third-party security, without neutral jurisdiction, without ironclad guarantees is, of course, just absurd. It is at best hollow and empty theatre, at worst a plan to end Zelensky's administration and his life. And that's before we mention the coercive leverage Moscow gains over whoever would attend, what routes are used to get there, what devices are scanned, where they stay, where they sleep, where the food and water comes from that they have to consume. And of course, if anything does happen, how any alleged incidents would be investigated on Russian soil. Arrive by plane, leave by window. It isn't just a joke, it's a risk assessment. Media credulity and the narrative trap. Well, parts of the press ran with the invitation as if it was a breakthrough. Fox News splashed, Putin invites Zelensky to a meeting in Moscow, while underplaying that Russia was bombing Ukraine as that story was unfolding. That's Fox News. Newsweek framed Putin as really keen for talks in Moscow. Yeah, I bet he is. Balanced titles were more cautious. They could be found. Reuters noted the unchanged demands and the venue ultimatum. Kiev Post placed the quote alongside the 100% security boast and, crucially, alongside the news that Putin's same-day threat to strike Western troops as legitimate targets was taking place while apparently he's making concessions. They pointed out the absurdity of that in the Kiev Post. On social channels, veteran Russian watchers called out the absurdity as well. Former US Ambassador Michael McFaul summarized the risk logic, arguing that insisting on Moscow as a venue for talks shows that Putin is not taking this seriously, and that asking Zelensky to fly to the country that's tried to kill him multiple times is not a good faith negotiation. He posted that on X, formerly Twitter, September 5th. Zelensky himself left no ambiguity. If your aim is to prevent a meeting, then inviting me to Moscow is the way to go. Of course, he's correct. Meanwhile, on the very day the invitation dominates headlines, Putin warned that Western personnel in Ukraine would be legitimate targets for their drones and their missiles. The contradiction isn't an error, it's a strategy. The story is crafted to sound conciliatory while reinforcing the Kremlin's coercive narratives. Accept Russia's terms on Russia's turf down the barrel of Russia's guns. We don't need to relearn 20 years of hard lessons about about the Russian state methods of negotiation. Report their words, yes, but put them in an appropriate historical context. This is what the media needs to do. Weigh the Kremlin's statements against the Kremlin's record that is written in polonium, Novichok, bullets, blood, and open windows. A just peace requires more than an invitation to the capital of the invader. It requires an honest broker, a neutral table, real concessions, and a discussion of guarantees that are credible. Putin is offering none of these.